We're here today on this 16th of May, 2022, Tetvav B'Iyar, with Rabbi Adam Mintz at his home in New York City. Shalom, Rabbi, and thank you for taking the time for this conversation as part of my program, Profiles of Faith.
Good. Thank you so much for including me in this project.
About Rabbi Mintz, the Rabbi is a modern Orthodox rabbi and an educator. How do you prefer to be called, Rabbi?
You can call me Rabbi.
Rabbi Mintz served as president of the New York Board of Rabbis and is a former rabbi of Lincoln Square Synagogue. He is the rabbi of Kilat Reim HaOvim. He founded on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He is also the director of 929 English, a web-based project that promotes daily study of a chapter of Tanakh. In addition, Rabbi Mintz is a member of the Talmud faculty at Yeshivat Ma'arat and has taught as an adjunct professor at City College. Rabbi, you obtained your smicha at YU Yeshivat El-Hanan in New York and received your PhD in Jewish history at New York University, where you wrote a dissertation on the topic of halacha in America. Are we correct so far?
You are correct.
You have a series of audio lectures I recommend highly, as listening to Rabbi Mintz. Teaching is a phenomenal experience. I don't know many teachers whose eloquence and knowledge is as accessible. On top of this, Rabbi Mintz is a family man, married to Sharon, with whom he has 3 grown children. For me, Rabbi Mintz is a teacher and a friend with whom I daven almost daily. Rabbi, you've done it all. From being the president of New York Board of Rabbis, to being a pulpit rabbi, a historian, and a teacher, doing conversions and helping with family counseling. You are a rabbi and an academic who taught it all. You are young and well-liked. What is left for you to do?
I don't know. Maybe this conversation will give you some ideas of what else there is to do.
You accomplished all of these things when you were barely 40 years old, right?
I don't know about that. It's been a few years since I've been 40.
Rabbi, my interview series is about honoring the past, looking up to our ancestors who preserved our tradition and who helped us to get here. You often speak about our sages' voices. You believe that the greatest challenge facing 21st century Jewry is the creation of an educated Jew who understands that the key to our Jewish future is the appreciation of our Jewish past. Tell us more about how you see this challenge.
First of all, I appreciate very much that you included me in this series. And it's interesting to think both about the Jewish past and the Jewish future. I started my career in a kind of a very traditional way. I was a student in Yeshiva University. I actually spent 9 years in Yeshiva University. I studied our past in the texts of the Gemara, in the texts of the Shulchan Aruch. But I studied our past in the texts of Jewish history and from some of the great scholars of our Jewish past. After I finished that period of study, I went and I taught for many years in yeshiva high schools around the city. And I was a rabbi in each of different communities. I was a pulpit rabbi. And then I went back and I began my PhD studies at NYU. And I studied specifically the history of the Jews in America. It was kind of personal, the history of the Jews of America. And specifically, I studied the history of the Eruv in North America. I was instrumental in creating the Eruv here on the West Side, which now is the Eruv in all of Manhattan, or most of Manhattan. It's the past, it's the future, and the question is how you weave the two of them together. That's really the challenge. And, you know, that's a complicated question. I'll just tell you about myself. I went to Yeshiva University. I teach in Maharat, which is very much modern Orthodox. Some people would say liberal modern Orthodox. Our shul is very much modern Orthodox. But actually, I'm a big believer in the fact that modern Orthodoxy might mean engaging the world of the present. But modern Orthodoxy cannot give up on engaging the world of the past. We need to engage all that was good about our past. Our parents, our grandparents, all the way back 2,000 years, the time of the rabbis. We talked before about the fact that we daven together in the B'yaner Shtibel every morning, Shabbos afternoons. The B'yaner Shtibel is an interesting place to daven. Biyan, what they call Boyan, is a Hasidic dynasty that has its roots in the majesty of the Rizhiner dynasty in Poland. And then the Bianer Rebbe actually came here to the United States around the year 1925. He was one of the first Hasidic Rebbes to live here in America. He lived on the Lower East Side. At the end of his life, he moved to the Upper West Side, and the shtibel is still in the building where he lived his last years. It's interesting. He died in 1971. There's been a shtibel for 50 years, for over 50 years, and there hasn't been a rabbi, hasn't been a rebbe, so to speak, in that shtibel. But the shtibel has basically modern Jews. Jews who are involved in the world, Jews who are businessmen, Jews who are professionals, Jews who are doctors, Jews who are lawyers. They're very much involved in the world. But the davening there, the learning there, is very authentic. So, we're brought up to think that authentic means that it's like the way that it was in Poland. But if it was like that way in Poland, it must have been that way. Moshe must have spoken Yiddish when he taught the Torah to Yehoshua, because how could it have been any other way? So the idea of being authentic is we can only be authentic as best we know how to be authentic. And that's to follow the ways of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and try to invest the modern Jew, our children, our grandchildren, with that authenticity, with that energy, with that knowledge of the generations that came before us.
Speaking about modern Orthodoxy, and it's interesting that you define the Brian Shtibel as a modern Orthodox place, just gives rise to the question, what is modern Orthodoxy? How do you define modern Orthodoxy, and especially when people in the modern Orthodox world are looking to the right shoulder to make sure that they are not being discounted as liberal by the growing right wing of our religious observant Jews?
So modern Orthodoxy is an interesting phrase. We know that Jews have been involved in the outside world, the secular world, for at least 2,000 years. The Jews in Babylonia were clearly involved with the with the outside world. All you need to do is learn Daf Yomi, all the stories of the Caesar and the Reish Galuta, and all the involvement and the interaction the Jews in Babylonia had with the secular authorities. The same thing was true in Muslim Spain. The same thing was true in Christian Spain. And then, more recently, the German experience of the 19th century, when the Jews were granted emancipation, Samson Raphael Hirsch, the Jews were very much part of Jewish culture and Jewish society. It was interesting. The German Jews had a funny kind of distinction. They would be very Orthodox at home, but when they went to the opera, they would take off their yarmulkes because they felt that there was a distinction between the world of Orthodoxy and the world of German culture. We don't really believe that anymore. Mostly Jews who are here in America came from Eastern Europe between the years 1881 and 1924. Before 1924, there were less than 500,000 Jews in America, probably closer to 300,000. Then between 1881 and 1924, over 2.5 million Jews came to America for a lot of different reasons, which isn't our discussion. Most of those Jews came to America Orthodox. There are traditions in my family. There's a tradition that my great-grandmother threw her sheitel overboard on the boat as they came to America. You should know the truth. The pictures of my great-grandmother in America, she was still wearing a sheitel. That makes the story more interesting because it's not a true story. It's a legend. The legend is better than the fact. That isn't the legend in our family. It was important that my great-grandmother didn't cover her hair anymore, that she threw her orthodoxy overboard on the boat over.
The Yentl story.
Right. So that's interesting. And the Jews here who came to America, they were really fighting for one thing. They were fighting to be American. The first generation, like all immigrants today, immigrants, we go to Israel, the first generation, it's very hard for them to acculturate. They don't know the language, they don't dress the dress, they don't know the culture. But by the second generation, the American Jews were fighting very, very hard to be American. And many of those American Jews made compromises. In those days, there was a 6-day-a-week work week, and people had to work on Shabbos. There were Orthodox Jews, but there weren't so many. Really, when we talk about modern Orthodoxy, we're talking about a phenomenon that began after the Second World War. Now, after the Second World War, a couple of interesting things happened. First of all, there were survivors. There were Hasidim, Hungarians who moved to the United They try to rebuild Hasidus. The story of Satmar is a fascinating story. There were Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva who came to America. Rabbi Cutler is the most famous. He tried to rekindle Torah in America. Just tell you that when Lakewood, there are 5,000 students in Lakewood today. 100,000 people live in Lakewood. Lakewood started in the 1940s in a room in Lakewood with 12 people around the table. So there wasn't much in terms of the Torah world. The YU Beis Medrash was almost empty in those days. Rabbi Soloveitchik would give class, but it was basically empty in those days. In those days, interestingly, the conservative movement was considered to be American Judaism. They could work on Shabbos, they could drive to shul, they kept kosher kinda. It was all very convenient, but they were very Jewish. And the davening in those days in the conservative shul, they didn't have women participate, obviously, in those days. The davening was very familiar. It was not that much different than the B'yana Shtibel, the conservative movement in the 50s and 60s. What happened was that in the 1960s and 1970s, as it became more Orthodox people, and that really was a function of the fact that it was easier to be Orthodox. There was no longer a 6-day work week. You could work 5 days a week. And there was the impact of Israel, especially after the 6-day war. People would spend more time in Israel. Some people would study in Israel. And a very important person in this history is Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who was the president of Yeshiva University from around 1977 until the early 2000s. And he himself coined a phrase called Torah Umada. Torah Umada was really the engagement of Torah together with world culture, but one that understood an integration between the two. And he made that really the calling card of Yeshiva University Orthodoxy. That's what became modern Orthodox in those days.
There's an irony because Torah and Mada suggest, as YU was at the time, was very modern. Today it's the bastion of right-wing.
So we'll
Orthodoxy.
talk about that. So what's interesting is in those days, Torah Mada was controversial. The right-wing Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Elias Svei, got up at an Aguda convention, and he was a Rosh Yeshiva of Philadelphia, and he criticized Rabbi Lamb. He said Rabbi Lamb had criticized him, and he criticized Rabbi Lamb. I mean, today that would never happen. But Torah Mada defined YU, and the yeshiva community was opposed to Torah Mada. Rabbi Cutler said you have to learn Torah, you can't be involved in the world, you can't go to college, you can't work. The Torah community was destroyed in Europe. We need only to learn. And there was really a dichotomy. On one side, there was the conservative movement that was becoming more liberal. On the other side, there was the Haredi movement, the yeshiva community that was becoming frummer, that was becoming more only Torah. And in the middle was YU, and those were good years in YU. Those were really good years in YU. The beginning was still the end of Rabbi Soloveitchik's, tenure in YU. Then Rabbi Lamb was very powerful. The Rosh Yeshiva were very much in the mode of Torah Mada. They were a little frummer maybe, but they all had gone to college, had been students in YU, students of Rabbi Soloveitchik. They were very much part of this. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who eventually moved to Israel, but also was seen as a leader also in America in terms of what Torah Mada meant. And then an interesting thing happened. It happened in two ways. In one way, not surprisingly, Yeshiva University became more like the Lakewood Beis Medrash. The world of Torah is a wonderful world. And people who learn Torah don't only learn Torah in modern Orthodox places. You had people who were in YU learning Torah in Lakewood, and people in Lakewood who were learning Torah in YU. It means the Torah, the Lithuanian Torah community, is really one. So over time, Yeshiva University, at least in the externals, began to look a little frummer. And there are people who were more committed to Torah, people learning Torah more. But there was no idea really of Kollel in YU. In YU, Kollel meant that you studied for a couple of years, but everybody went to work. They went to work as a rabbi, they went to work as a professional, everybody went to work. What happened in the Lakewood of today, let's jump to today. 100,000 people work in Lakewood. Almost everybody works in Lakewood. You see, we don't live in Israel, where education is paid for and you can be supported by tzedakah. And therefore you can be 70 years old and you can learn in Kollel. In America, it doesn't work that way. You can't operate that way because education costs money and housing costs money and living costs money. So everybody has to work. So a funny thing happened that all of a sudden, what we call the Haredim, the yeshiva community, the descendants of Aaron Cutler, began slowly to embrace the fact that their graduates needed to work also. Now, they didn't go to university, or at least they didn't all go to university, but they all figured out how to be educated in what they needed to be educated in. They took computer courses. There's someone in the Beyond Stiebel whose son didn't really go to college, but somehow managed to go to Harvard Law School. They all knew how to do these things. They figured out how to do it. Now, Rabbi Lamb wouldn't have been all that happy with that because Rabbi Lamb wants you to go to 4 years of college. Rabbi Lamb wants you to study philosophy, and Rabbi Lamb, majored in chemistry, and Rabbi Lamb would have wanted you to get a real education. The yeshiva bachrim don't get a real education. But the bottom line today is that there's not much of a distinction between the balabas who's living in Lakewood and working, and his kids are going to yeshiva, but they're also going to work at some point. And the person in Teaneck and Woodmere and Boca Raton who looks a little more modern, but they're learning Daf Yomi and they're working and they're sending the kids to yeshiva university. There's not all that much difference. The difference is really in the externals, and that's neither here nor there, right? That some people wear black hats, some people don't wear black hats, some people have payas behind their ears, and some people have payas that go down the sides of their faces. Those externals kind of have to do with the past and how we connect with the past rather than how we embrace the future. You can have, world famous oncologists working, going with black hats. It doesn't mean that they're Haredim and they reject the world. It just means they have to wear a black hat for whatever reason. They wear a black hat. So that's interesting about modern Orthodoxy. I kind of think that modern Orthodoxy has kind of lost that kind of energy that it had in Rabbi Lamb's day. And I know that because in Yeshiva University, you'll never hear the term modern Orthodoxy. You won't hear the term Torah Mad anymore. Yeshiva University is a place where you learn Torah in the morning and you get an education in the afternoon, and you do whatever you want with that education. It's kind of, there's no ideology in Yeshiva University anymore. The same way, honestly, there's no ideology in Lakewood. You learn Torah. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to learn Torah. And then when you get married and you have to get a job, you get a job. It's not an ideology the way it once was an ideology. And that's really a luxury that we have. We have a luxury. We can learn Torah. We can be Orthodox. We can be as Orthodox as we want. We can choose where we learn. We can get good jobs. People can become wealthy. There's a luxury to it today, which allows us to live the way we do. Now, there is one group, when we talk about modern Orthodoxy, we have to be fair. There is one group that still tries to maintain that idea of modern Orthodoxy, of really engaging not only the world, but engaging the challenges of the world, engaging the gay and lesbian community, engaging conversion, engaging the trans community. And that's really, that world, I would say, would be identified in the Orthodox community with Rabbi Avi Weiss. It was identified with Rabbi David Hartman. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is very involved in that world. And that's a world of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, a world of Maharat. And they try to really engage the world and engage the problematic, the people who don't quite fit, in the regular kind of community. And what's interesting is that, they have a community, but their community, you have to tell the truth, their community has very little impact on the broader Orthodox community. Obviously, they have no impact on the Lakewood community, but their impact on the Yeshiva University community is very limited. And therefore, the people from that community aren't really impacting the community in Teaneck or Woodmere or Boca Raton. They're really very much within their own community. So it's interesting that modern Orthodoxy, the way we would probably define modern Orthodoxy today, has actually, while the modern Orthodoxy of Rabbi Lamb's day, I think defines Orthodox Judaism generally. Hasidim always worked, and now everybody's working. Really, Rabbi Lamb would look at the world today, and he should be very proud. It wasn't a world that he knew in 1975 when he took over YU, but it's a world that is true today. The liberal modern Orthodox community, while I think it does important things, there's a part of me that's part of that world, but I think that their impact is very, very limited. I think that's important to say.
You said a lot of important things, and I want to touch on a few of these issues. First of all, there's a line that Rabbi David Hartman's son, Daniel Hardman always says that we're victims of being liked too much. When they didn't like us, we could stay in our own shtetl. But now that they like us, we marry them, they love us, and they marry us. We are accepted everywhere, and that weakens the orthodoxy in the modern Orthodox. We are more modern than Orthodox. But what's interesting that you mentioned that they are encouraged to work. And yet the education that you got in history, or Rabbi Lichtenstein got in literature, or Rabbi Soloveitchik got in philosophy, or the Rebbe, this is not what people get now in YU. They get into computers, into trading, finance, law, and medicine. Very few people that I know who go to YU learn philosophy or literature or other non-practical, job-oriented skills.
That's not a function of Judaism. That's a function of the humanities. That's true in the academic world in which we live. The number of people getting PhDs in philosophy is far fewer than it was 70 years ago. The number of people who go to school and are interested in history or interested in, obscure topics is much less than it was. People are pre-professional. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of opportunity, and people, are running after that opportunity. Now, everything is cyclical. It's hard to know what'll happen, but at this point, just like in YU, they're pre-professional. In Harvard, they're pre-professional. In University of Maryland, they're pre-professional. And in Brandeis, they're pre-professional. And any school you're going to mention, they tend to be pre-professional. They're not really interested in the humanities today.
Rabbi, we're speaking about the past. Tell us more about your family, where you grew up, and the major influences on your life.
I grew up in Washington, D.C., an Orthodox community in Washington, D.C. My rabbi was Rabbi Hillel Clavin. He was a graduate of Ner Yisrael. He was what you would call in those days more Orthodox, and he was very much an influence in our community. He was an important person in our community. So that was the community that we come from. My parents grew up in Brooklyn. My father was born in 1927 in Milwaukee. My grandfather was an early graduate of what we call YU today, Rabbi Chana. My grandfather was moved as a 23-year-old rabbi to Ottawa. He was single then. Then he met my grandmother, who comes from Quebec City. Her father was manufactured suits in Quebec City. He made the uniforms for the Canadian Army in the First World War. They had a shidduch, right? Ottawa, Canada, Quebec City, it was Canada. They had a shidduch, and they got married. They went to Malava, Poland for their honeymoon. They took a boat to Malava, Poland for 4 months for their honeymoon. Can you imagine that? My grandmother, 60 years later, still complained about that honeymoon. She had to pack a trunk to take a boat to Malava, Poland to visit my grandfather's family in Malava, Poland. And they moved then to Milwaukee. My grandfather got a job. If you look at the book on the history of the Jews in Milwaukee, they talk about a young Rabbi Mintz, Rabbi Max Mintz, who became the rabbi there in 1926. My father was born on Shabbos Mevarchim Chodesh Elul in 1927. And in 1928, they moved to Brooklyn. And as I always like to say, whenever I speak in Brooklyn of 1928 is not like Brooklyn of 2022. My father always said that he was the only one who walked down the street with a yarmulke. And that's because he had to walk down the street with the yarmulke. His father was the rabbi. He went to Yeshiva Flatbush. He started at 4 years old. He went to Yeshiva Flatbush. Yeshiva Flatbush in those days only had to 8th grade. After 8th grade, you made a decision. You either went to Torah V'das or you went to Midwood High School. My grandfather wanted my father to go to Torah V'das. My grandmother wanted my father to go to Midwood. And of course, my grandmother won, like in all good Jewish families. My grandmother won. My father went to Midwood High School. He loved Midwood High School. Those, he always said, were the best years of his life. He used to come home at the end of Midwood High School, and he used to study Baba Basra with my grandfather. I don't know if it's a story or a legend, but the story is that when they finished Baba Basra, my grandfather got my father a typewriter. And we understand what that means. That means he got him a laptop, right? He got him the laptop of 1943 or something. And that was his big treat. And he always was happy about the typewriter that he got as a present.
He became a writer?
He became a lawyer, but he went to Brooklyn Law School. He then switched to City College. He always says that he used to read Shakespeare. The reason he knew Shakespeare is because he used to read Shakespeare on the train to City College. He went and he got smicha at YU. That was mostly because my grandfather wanted him to have smicha. He didn't want to be a rabbi, but he went to smicha. He used to go between City College and Yeshiva University. He used to take the trolley up Amsterdam Avenue from City College on 137th Street to YU on 185th Street. YU in those days, just to explain, see, YU wasn't a good fit for an American young man. My father was Orthodox. His father was a rabbi. My father was Orthodox all his life. But my father wanted to be American. My father wanted to be Orthodox. My father wanted to go to Columbia Law School. He went to Columbia Law School. He got into Harvard Law School too, but my grandmother didn't want him to leave New York, so he went to Columbia Law School. He loved Columbia Law School. He was involved in something called ISFA, which was the Zionist organization. He traveled to Israel in 1951, which was extremely early. He was very Orthodox. More Orthodox. He was modern Orthodox.
But he wasn't a rabbi.
But he wasn't a rabbi. He had rabbi. The beginning of his name was Rabbi, but he was never a rabbi. But he wanted to be American. That's what he was interested in. He wanted to be American. He never learned Yiddish. My grandparents spoke Yiddish. He never learned Yiddish. He didn't want to know Yiddish, wasn't interested in Yiddish. And his rebbes in YU had come after the war, and they didn't like America. He would always talk, it's now May. He would always talk about one of his rebbes, Rabbi Rucham Gorelik, who grew up in the brisk tradition in Lithuania. And he said Rabbi Gorelik used to come into Shir on Memorial Day. In those days, they used to call it Decoration Day. My father would always say Decoration Day. And he used to come in, he used to make fun of the American kids who were waving their American flags. He said, these stupid American kids, they're waving American flags. And my father, that struck my father, because my father didn't wave an American flag. But, he liked America. Why should you make fun of someone who's waving an American flag? He wanted to be American. And that's what he was. He was American. And he grew up, and he became a professional in the decades when being a liberal Jewish American was the thing. And then my parents got married in 1959, and they moved immediately to Washington. And my father's career was as a lawyer in the government in Washington. And he was always involved in the shul. And he always, kind of had a role in the shul. And later in his life, when he retired, he actually became a professor in Catholic University Law School for many years. And then he started teaching in the shul for a whole bunch of reasons. The shul didn't have a rabbi. And he started teaching in the shul. And he passed away last year at 93. And literally till the last month of his life, he was teaching people who would come to the house that he would teach. My mother was born in 1934 in Brooklyn. Her parents, her father, actually she has an interesting story. Her father was born in Pittsburgh. His father was a rabbi, Aaron Ashinsky. I'm named after him. Rabbi Aaron Mordechai Ashinsky was one of the early Zionist Orthodox rabbis in Pittsburgh. And my mother went to Shalama School. Shalama School was very modern Orthodox. My mother started in Ramaz High School, but she didn't like the trip from Brooklyn, so she finished up in New Utrecht, then she went to New Utrecht High School, then she went to Brandeis. That also was interesting. Brandeis had just begun. That was the Jewish university. It wasn't the Jewish university, it was the university for Jews. It was a regular secular university, but there was still this idea that Jews couldn't get into the fancy university, so they went to Brandeis. So my mother was part of the first generation of women who went to Brandeis. My mother has a PhD in psychology. She was a clinical psychologist for her entire career. That was the beginning of the generation where women were working. Not every woman worked, but my mother worked all the time. And we grew up in a modern Orthodox house. It was very modern Orthodox. It was very American. What does it mean? It means we kept Shabbos and we kept Kashrus and we kept the Yom Tovim, and my father would love to learn and give the Rei Torah and things like that. But we were American. We were absolutely American. We went to the Smithsonian every Sunday. We watched football on Sunday afternoon. We were just American. My father went to work every morning, never missed a day of work. We had 2 weeks of vacation in the summer. That was it. We were American. That's what I knew was being American. I went to the Hebrew Academy of Washington. That was a school in Washington. For high school, I came to New York. My parents thought that the high school in Washington was a little too frum. The head of the high school was someone from Tells. That was still in the days where there was a difference and it made a difference. So my parents didn't like the high school in Washington. I came to Rabbi Riskin's high school in New York. Then I went to YU, and the rest is history. So, growing up in Washington was interesting. We had a community. Some of my friends in New York had communities. Some of them didn't have communities. In Washington, the community was very important. People who I grew up with are people who I'm still friendly with today. Even if I'm not friendly with them today, I know them today. I'm very much a Washingtonian. My wife grew up on the Upper West Side. She grew up at 300 Central Park West, and she considers herself a West Sider. She, in her years, she did live other places. Her parents moved out, and she did live in other places. She lived in Israel for a couple of years, but she considers herself a West Sider. She's proud to be a West Sider. I'm proud to be an out-of-towner. So, it's just kind of a difference. I don't know if it makes any difference. I don't know that we think any difference from one another, but just in terms of the way we look at our past, that's always a very important thing. And the idea that, my parents, especially my father, for whom, in those days it was more important for the men in terms of the Torah world, the fact that he grew up modern Orthodox, but that being American was what was important to him, that was more or less true for all the fathers of my friends. They daven, some of them daven once a day, some of them daven 3 times a day. They all kept Shabbos, they all did all the right stuff. But they were Americans. That was the way they would define themselves. They were American Orthodox Jews. Today, we don't think so much about it. We all are Americans. Right? Nobody speaks Yiddish anymore, none of that. I mean, and to be honest, they're also Americans, very, very American. Some people today, because we have the luxury, so they kind of dress non-American and they act non-American sometimes. They try to act more authentic. But the truth of the matter is that's a luxury. That's because America allows for us to do that. But I think it's important to remember, we think about the history of Orthodoxy in America today, I think it's important to remember that we are who we are because the generation of our parents, was very committed to being American. Now, it's not across the board true. My story is not the only story. It's a prevalent story. There are a lot of people who tell my story. For whatever reason, we didn't have survivors in Washington. I don't know why that is. But we didn't have survivors in Washington. We had Americans in Washington. Maybe that's because the government attracted Americans more than children of survivors. But we didn't really have survivors. But that's my story.
So, Rabbi, I understand why you're a historian. But what I'd like to know is what inspired you to become a rabbi. Was it because you were close to your grandfather, or because your father didn't want to be a rabbi? So what was that made you...
That's a fair question. You say they skipped the generation. I was close to my grandfather. He didn't really influence me to be a rabbi. The person who influenced me most was Rabbi Riskin. The high school I went to was Rabbi Riskin's high school in Riverdale. Those were some very good years. Rabbi Riskin had a high school. We had very, very good teachers in those years. And Rabbi Riskin was a big believer in the fact that his students should become rabbis. And my friends all became rabbis. Different flavors, but we all became rabbis. We were very much influenced by Rabbi Riskin, and we used to spend Shabbos with Rabbi Riskin, and he used to, very, very much, studied the way that he was a rabbi.
The beautiful thing is that you became a rabbi of Rabbi Riskin's
Right, so I was Lincoln Square Synagogue was very much different in my day, but yeah, Rabbi Riskin, that's a whole other story. There are a lot of pieces of modern Orthodoxy in America today that Rabbi Riskin created. He didn't create... He didn't create him as modern Orthodoxy. Lincoln Square Synagogue was a different kind of shul. Just want to know just interesting things. They have a beginner's service, the outreach movement. The outreach movement within modern Orthodoxy was really started by Rabbi Riskin. He brought in Rabbi Ephraim Buchwald to run a beginner's service, but Rabbi Riskin is the one who had this idea that we should make Bali Tshuva. Before Rabbi Riskin, the idea of Bali Tshuva didn't really exist. So it's interesting, just the influence Rabbi Riskin had, the idea of Talmud Torah, the idea of having shiurim on Shabbos morning. He brought in Rabbi David Silber, who started his own organization called Drisha. But Rabbi Riskin is the one who really had these ideas before anybody else had these ideas. So.
Beautiful. You're explaining your evolution to becoming a rabbi in very strong affiliation. But I want to know what inspired your sense of love of Hashem, of God. I like this question of when did you discover God personally the first time? Outside of the stories of yeshiva or the school, or you should do this, not that. Did you wake up one day and say, I have a personal sense of God?
So my education is very Lithuanian. I find my religion through the study of texts. That's true since I was 14 years old. And, my connection to Judaism is through learning. I was in high school. We used to learn. We used to learn in the mornings. We were very much influenced by our Gemara teacher, Rabbi Yitzchak Adler, who was the Gemara teacher, and we're still close to him, 45 years later. I used to have chavrusas who I'm still close to. We what you call find God. We didn't talk about it in those terms, but we found God through learning. That was true in YU. We learned, day after day, night after night, for week after week, month after month, year after year, and that's how we found God. And those are our friends now. And they, when we get together, we still talk about learning.
The irony is not lost on me that we're davening in a Hasidic shul, where there is not the Litvak side, is the more spiritual.
So that's what's interesting about today, and that is that distinction doesn't really exist anymore. Actually, the B'yaner Shtibel, there's a lot of learning in the B'yaner Shtibel. They have a Daf Yomi, and they emphasize learning on Shabbos, and it's not Hasidus in the old sense of Hasidus. I think that's an important thing. The same way that the Lithuanians probably have more singing than they probably would have had in Vilna of old. It's interesting. I'll just tell you a story. Just want to know a little bit about things. So this morning I did conversions, and we had somebody, believe it or not, who flew in from Vilna to convert. This is somebody whose grandfather was Jewish, always was connected to Judaism, but there's not much in Vilna now. There's a Chabad rabbi, and a friend of mine, went to Vilna to do a wedding for somebody. A crazy story. Somebody lived here, but wanted to go back to where they came from in Vilna. And this young man met this rabbi there in Vilna and said, "I want to convert." And he started learning for conversion. And he came now here and he's going back to Vilna to convert. So it's a funny world we live in.
It's funny you talk about conversions. You do a lot of conversions. Are these mostly couple-oriented conversions, where one converts to marry a Jew, or are there people who want to become Jew for no practical reasons?
Today we had a convert. She's getting a PhD in Jewish studies from Columbia. She has no boyfriend. She's actually Asian. And she got connected to Judaism. She grew up in Brooklyn. She got connected to Judaism. She went to Harvard College, studied history, then went to Columbia in graduate school, and she's getting a PhD. She's writing about blood libels. It's crazy. You think about it, it's crazy. She, her whole life is Judaism, and now finally today she converted to Judaism. We always interview our converts and usually ask them questions, things like that. She had a whole Dvar Torah waiting for us. She spoke to us for 15 minutes about how she found God and giving different Torah and quoting psukim. By the time she finished, I said, "Okay, let's go to the mikvah." I mean, we've never had anything like that before. Beautiful. So it's funny, people convert for different reasons. Conversion is one of those things that the mainstream Orthodox community deals with under the table. Every Orthodox community is dealing with conversions because that's what Daniel Hartman said. They love us too much. They love the Orthodox too much also. They may wear a black hat when they daven mincha, but they love us too much. Those guys go to work in law firms and work in accounting firms and work in investment banks. And you know what? It happens that they're going to meet non-Jews, and sometimes it happens, and there's conversion. And I think that we should deal with conversion on top of it. I think that we'll do better, creating these Jewish families if we deal with it on top of the table. That we work with these families, we make them more religious, and I think that it's nice. I think we don't do enough conversion. I think we need to do. The Orthodox community needs to do more conversion. Someone told me that the biggest reform conversion program in America, there's 2,000 conversions a year. I think the Orthodox community needs to do 2,000 conversions a year. I think we need to do conversions because we used to think that if you don't do the conversion, so the Jewish boy will break up with the non-Jewish girl, and then he'll marry a nice Jewish girl from Tibet. But now we're much smarter than that. It's not going to happen that way. What's going to happen is that they'll get a conservative conversion or a reform conversion or no conversion at all. We do better by converting these people Orthodox.
Interesting. Conversion is one of the major topics discussed throughout the Torah and in Gemara. Every Masechet has Gerim throughout it. It's a major topic, and specifically we're commanded to remember the ger and to be kind to the ger. So conversions are not under the table in the Torah, they're just under the table socially because we don't want to appear our yichus to be compromised.
That's correct.
But, interesting, my wife was just learning in a women's group in Lincoln Square. She said there was an Asian Jew there who converted because she read a book about chinuch of children, and she found that this is a better way to teach, to raise children. And she became a Jew because of that. And her kids are not Jewish, and the whole family is Jewish, just accidentally coming upon.
It's amazing. The whole thing is amazing. Yeah. So conversion is its own topic. I don't know if now is the time to talk about it, but it's an important topic to discuss.
Rabbi, we're in the middle of Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the 49 days, the 7 Shabbatot between Pesach and Shavuos. And these 7 sevens, the Sfira, the Shemitah, the Yovel, we just did the Parsha now, Bahar, we're talking about Yovel. This 7 business, we know 7 day of creation, but even a Litvak can see there's something spiritual, Kabbalistic going on here. We know about a lot of the rules, but there is some Geschmack.
I mean, the Kabbalists, talked about the Sfirot, the emanations of God, and 7 was important. In the Shtibel this week, they don't say Tachnun, because this is the week of the Sfirah, the emanation that's called Hod, and for some reason that's special, and therefore they don't, they don't say Tachnun this week. I'll tell you that I grew up with a story. The story was always that, they went to the Rosh Yeshiva of Telz, and they asked him, how do they celebrate Lag BaOmer in Telz? It's for this week. How do they celebrate Lag BaOmer in Telz? And Rosh Yeshiva answered, he says, in Telz we don't say Tachnun on Lag BaOmer. Meaning, we don't believe in all this stuff. We don't have all that. We don't make bonfires. We don't do this, and we don't do that. We don't say Tachnun on Lag BaOmer. So, that's a good question. You asked me about sevens. My education doesn't tell me anything about 7. When I hear sevens, what I think to myself is there are some round numbers in Judaism. 7 is one of those round numbers. Now, that's interesting. There's a book that we were just reading by a Professor Henkin from Berkeley. It's called The Week. It's an interesting question about the week. Where does the week come from? The idea that we divide the week into 7 days is not something that was accepted by everybody. There were some people after the French Revolution, the French tried to introduce something that wasn't 7 days. They thought they would change the week, and therefore they would gain control, because that's power if you change the week. The truth of the matter is the Jews always had the week, and then the Christians took the week from the Jews, and the Muslims took the week from the Christians and the Jews. The idea of the week is 7 days. That's an interesting story. We introduced to the world the idea of 7. To me, that's good. I don't know anything about emanations, but I know the fact that we made a tremendous contribution, that we introduced the idea of the week. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, we could work on a 10-day cycle. The interesting thing is that 7 is not right, because the month is 30 days. And therefore, the divisions should be divisions of 30. We should be divided in 5s or divided in 6s, because that's a division of 30. It doesn't work properly. And that's why the first of the month is not always in the same day of the week. We would think that the first of the month should be in the same day of the week. Actually, the Sadducees had this problem with Sfiras HaOmer. Sfiras HaOmer is also one of these things that varies. Meaning we start carrying Sfirat HaOmer from the second day of Pesach till Shavuos, but the second day of Pesach can fall any time during the week, and Shavuos can fall any time during the week. Therefore, we need Sfirat HaOmer counters, and we need reminders on our Apple Watches to count Sfirat HaOmer. But the Sadducees said, no. Pasuk says, Mimachras HaShabbos. Every year they had Pesach on Shabbos, and they started counting Sfirat HaOmer from Sunday, and therefore, every year Sfirat HaOmer was exactly the same, so they could remember it from year to year. That's not a small thing, because in those days, before they had writing and before they had iPhones and all those things, obviously, you had to remember things. It was much easier to remember things if this year was like last year and last year was like the year before.
You're touching on one of the topics that is close to my heart, which is the irony of how we like to have so much order, but the world makes a very strong effort to disorder all the order.
That's why we need order. That's why you talk about it. You say about Hasidim. That's why the Litvaks need order.
I think that the irony is, men. What's the expression in Yiddish? Men plans and God laughs. So maybe the answer to your question is God didn't want us to be so orderly because the world is not orderly. Maybe the order is our trying to shape things into nice boxes, but nothing fits in nature or in Judaism in nice boxes. God doesn't work according to our plans for God. God wants us to adapt to His world. Like, we have to adapt to a world where there's no order. And when we do that, we live in God's world of 7. So maybe that's why we have 7 as a primary number and not a number that fits so perfectly into the boxes.
Your little excursion through the week, through 7, is probably a disagreement between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim. The Misnagdim believed in order. Everything we have is order. You have 7 days of the week. You have Shabbos. You have holidays, a specific time. You have the time for Kriyas Shema. You have the time for Shmon Esrei. You have the time for Mincha. You have time for Mar. Everything is order. A real Litvak is obsessed. They always said the Brisker Rav was so rigid because everything had to be perfect. It had to be said exactly right. The Brisker Rav would say Shema, 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 because he had to pronounce the word properly because everything is so orderly. It has to be done exactly that way. There's no flexibility. And the Hasidim came and they actually thought, interestingly, that was elitist because, you have to be pretty smart to know all of that. To know how to recite Kriyas Shema properly, to know when to daven Mincha, to know when to daven Mar. That's very elitist. They didn't like that. The common person daven Shachris when they're able to daven Shachris because maybe they work late at night and maybe they can't daven Shachris at 7 o'clock in the morning. So their religion was much more for the common person. This isn't necessarily the distinction between Misnagdim and Hasidim today, but at the beginning of Hasidus, this was true. There were those who studied Torah, but basically it was very, very good for the common person for whom this order they couldn't manage with the order. To the Litvak, disorder is totally discombobulated. They don't know what to do when something happens that changes the order. And that's why, if you want to talk about all these things, that's why COVID was such a crisis for the Litvaks. That's why in Lakewood they couldn't close the yeshiva. The Hasidim closed the yeshivas. The Hasidim closed the shuls because Hasidim, what difference does it make? So today you daven at 10 o'clock and then now you tell me you'll daven in 2 months from now or 2 years from now. It's okay. It's all good, right? What difference does it make? The Litvak could not handle it. They went to the Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood and they said, you have to close the yeshiva. People are dying in Lakewood. He said, the yeshiva was never closed. Yeshivas had never been closed. We lived in Poland, we lived in Lithuania, they didn't close the yeshivas. There were pogroms, there was Holocaust, there was this, there was that. We never closed the yeshiva. We're not going to close the yeshiva. Literally, he refused to close the yeshiva. They had to get the governor to come to Lakewood to close the yeshiva. But they weren't arguing about COVID. They were arguing about the fact that exactly what you said, if you're going to introduce something that changes that rigid order that they're familiar with, literally they're so discombobulated they don't know what to do with themselves.
It's interesting because they have their own compromises that they make peace with. They just don't like to compromise with what they don't compromise with.
Of course, everybody's like that. You have to function. But I'm just saying, there's no Eruv in the Lithuanian communities. It's all this rigidity. And, and it's so interesting that played itself out in COVID.
Rabbi, as a person with such well-rounded perspective, I want to spend some time hearing your views on different challenges facing the Jewish world, both in the US and in Israel. We have a fragmented culture that collides on multiple issues, on the support of Israel, on women's role in Judaism, on gender, on different types of observance, on access to those groups, to the Rabbanut in Israel and to the Kotel, to prayer. The issues are great and time is limited. Please tell us how you see these challenges and the path to address them if possible.
Support of Israel, so what happened was that, for many decades, Jews were Democrats. It was automatic. My father brought us up that, you went to the voting booth with him and you just, clicked down the row of Democrats. They were very grateful to FDR. They were brought up, that generation, to believe that FDR, brought Jews to America and took care of Jews and, had plans for, employed the Jews. It basically gave us our chance to become Americans. Over time, in the past 30 years, probably starting with Reagan, slowly that changed. And under Donald Trump, that really changed. All of a sudden, the Orthodox Jews tended to support Trump, and the more liberal Jews were anti-Trump. That's important for this conversation, because all of a sudden, the Orthodox Jews supported Trump and were very outspoken about their support of Israel and their support of the settlements in Israel. And the more liberal Jews, tended to go the other way, to be more liberal and to kind of, have the traditional democratic approach to Israel. It's a very problematic topic in America. It's very problematic within the Orthodox community. It's very divisive within the Orthodox community. Trump was very divisive in the Orthodox community. Jared Kushner was very divisive within the Orthodox community. Ambassador David Friedman was very divisive in the Orthodox community. We have not resolved that. I think that's important. In terms of women's involvement, so the truth of the matter is, and this is the same thing, and that is that within mainstream Orthodoxy, women's learning is acceptable, and women's participation in ritual in davening has not become acceptable yet. Women learn. Women learn Gemara. Women become yoatzot. They learn halacha. That's all acceptable. I mean, there are different shades of how it's acceptable, but basically, women learn. But the idea of women davening, women reading the Torah, going to Darchei Noam, all these kinds of things, interestingly enough, didn't take off. It just didn't take off. Yeah, you have partnership minyanim in every community. There's a little partnership minyan, but it never took off. To me, that's reflective of the fact that modern Orthodoxy doesn't mean modern Orthodoxy anymore. It mean, Avi Weiss likes, partnership minyanim. So when they have Avi Weiss, so they have partnership minyanim. But it hasn't impacted. So in a place like Boca Raton, I'm sure there's no partnership minyan. Where there's a partnership minyan, it's secretive. It's in a basement somewhere and it doesn't have very many people. Orthodoxy has defined itself. Now that's not good. When I talked about this to a group on Shabbos and a group of Israelis on Shabbos, my wife said, you have to say, that's not good. That's correct. It's not good. The fact that in Boca Raton they don't know how to deal with the gay and lesbian, children in their community, that's not good. But that is the reality. That's where we are. That those people who don't quite fit in, those people on the margins, are unfortunately not taken care of. Now, we live in thank God, a world of luxury and a world of internet. So everybody's able to take care of themselves, or hopefully can take care of themselves. But that's a problem. You want to say how we deal with those problems? Orthodoxy is not dealing with those problems. YU is not dealing with those problems. YU dealt with COVID. The Rosh Yeshiva dealt with COVID. Rabbi Asher Weiss, he wears a shtreimel. He was the big posek when it came to COVID. They finally did pretty well when it came to COVID. They are not dealing with the social issues of today. It's terrible. But it's not going to undermine orthodoxy, because as long as those issues are marginal issues, then those issues are going to be dealt with under the table. They're not going to be dealt with on top of the table. Now, we suffer from that because as American Jews, we are influenced by all the cultural phenomena, and we within Orthodoxy are not dealing with that. I think that's going to have to be addressed.
It's a crisis for more reason than what you mentioned. It's basically anything that polarizes our community and divides us, we lose more and more people who could otherwise be part of the big tent of Judaism. And then we are bunkering and say, you see, we knew that they were not really like us because we make the rules more and more extreme. But the Talmud in Sanhedrin determines the idea of pshara, the compromise, that it's better than a chumrah, the law piercing the mountain. But today's Jewish world is backing away from such. Everything is about chumrah. Whenever one suggests some change, there's always the fear of what if, the paradigm of mixed dancing, and assimilation. You would think that God-fearing person would have faith that in doing the right thing, everything else will fall into place. But there is so much paranoia, maybe you'll have a better word for that, of assimilation. But we are causing some of this assimilation because we're making the rules too extreme, too hard to abide by. So if a child in a frum family who has influences from both sides, all of a sudden sees things moving and more extreme, he says, I don't want to have a part of that. And that is a growing part of modern Orthodox second generation reality. I see it myself in my friends' lives.
So that's interesting and might be a bigger issue in Israel than in America. Let me just say that, first of all, it's not about chumrah. That was a Saul Berman term 40 years ago. I think chumrah is what's convenient. You said it before. People are machmir, in the kind of bread they buy. It has to be pas Yisrael. That's just because it's convenient, because all bread is pas Yisrael, so they can say we're machmir about pas Yisrael. Chumrah is only important when it's inconvenient, right? It's only, I once knew somebody who said about going to a hafganah, going to a rally in Israel. They said, it's easy to go to a rally. Say, I want to know, they said, someone who goes to a rally where there's no bathroom in the place of the rally. If someone's willing to go to a rally where there's no bathroom, then they're really committed. I have the same view about chumrah. Don't tell me about chumrah. Tell me about a chumrah that's actually inconvenient for you. Tell me about a chumrah that actually affects you. And I don't think that they have those chumras. I think if you go to the Anish people and you want to know what the chumras are, I think the chumras are things that are not fundamental. I think in the things that are fundamental, they know how to operate. But I think what's interesting is in the last year or so, there's a fascinating guy who actually is one of the 36 under 36 in the Jewish Week this week came out with a list of 36 under 36. His name is David Bashevkin. David Bashevkin has a podcast, and he interviews these Orthodox leaders who have been forced to deal with these kind of marginal situations. He interviewed basically Rosh Yeshiva in YU who has a gay son. It was amazing. It was like the most unbelievable thing. Talked about how they were basically, alienated from one another, and how he came back to understand them and to embrace them. He interviewed a prominent Orthodox rabbi whose daughter had eating issues and she was institutionalized, and he didn't know how to deal with that either. I think, you see, what's going to happen is we're going to have to find out that these issues are within Orthodoxy. For a long time, they didn't admit it. I also talked to the Israeli group. You think that nobody in Lakewood, their children, you think no one in Lakewood ever married a convert? I promise you that they're doing conversions in Lakewood. I don't know it, but they're doing conversions in Lakewood.
There are gays in Lakewood too.
And there are gays in Lakewood. And there are gays in Lakewood too, but it's not above the table yet. What David Bashevkin did was he put this stuff on the table in YU. You can't say that there are no gays in YU anymore, because there's a Rosh Yeshiva in YU who was told by the other Rosh Yeshiva in YU that you can't embrace your son, who's embracing his son. Now, what's YU going to do about it? They're going to throw him out of YU, or they're not going to throw him out of YU. That's the irony. They can't throw him out of YU. And he now is, has championed this topic. So these are all real issues. Now, it's going to take a very long time because they're not training them in Yeshiva University to deal with these issues. The only way to train rabbis to deal with these issues is you have to train rabbis to take risks, and to make mistakes, and all of those things. And we're not training our professionals generally. It has nothing to do with rabbis, right? We're telling lawyers that they can't make mistakes, and if you can make mistakes, you don't become a partner. And we're telling investment bankers, if you make mistakes, you get fired. And we're telling doctors, if you make mistakes, you're killing people.
The only people allowed to make mistakes is businessmen, because they can learn from mistakes.
That's correct. So a businessman, you run your own business, you make mistakes. That's why they make the $1 billion, right? Right? Mark Zuckerberg makes mistakes and he makes $1 billion. That's correct. So it's not Judaism's fault, but until we train the rabbis that not only is it okay to make mistakes, but you better make mistakes and you better take risks and you better, do all these things, then we're not going to be successful. Now, it's very tricky. You want to know about something else? It's very tricky because in today's world, everybody's so vulnerable because of social media. So you read all these stories about these rabbis. Some of the stories are terrible. Some of the stories where the rabbis are criminal and they do terrible things. But sometimes it's not that simple. And sometimes, it's just an angry congregant or an angry student or something who posts something, and and the rabbi's career is finished, and or the Jewish professional's career is finished, and they're humiliated. It's a very, very fine line we walk, and you understand why people don't want to take risks.
I find an interesting connection in both things. In the Chumrah, where you said convenience defines Chumrah. If it's convenient, then the Chumrah can thrive. And now I find that if there's a personal connection, then rabbis are going to include these marginal issues. So it has to be still convenience, some connection to life.
It's self-serving.
Because life
it's self-serving, of course, and people are busy. People are busy. The rabbi has a lot of things to deal with. So, you have to deal with the gay. They is mir. You have a gay son, and you want to know whether the gay son, he has a partner, and you want me to come to the wedding or to the whatever it is. And now, it's so complicated, and it's going to be ramifications, and some people are going to like it, and some people are not going to like it, and I'm going to have to make a decision. And I call the rabbis, and the rabbis tell me this, and the rabbis tell me that. It's a big deal. You have to. You have to be the kind of person with the rabbi. You have to be the kind of person who's willing to take that chance, who's willing to take that risk. It's a big risk.
We can look in the history of Judaism. That's what led to zealots. That's what led to shrinking of marginalization of groups, because they actually became their chumrah, their certain insistence became the bastion of their religion. So we took the Asaites, and the zealots, and what is the name of the group of who used to kill people in Jerusalem to make sure that there's no compromises?
Sicaries.
you can say that this is what brought us to the Churban with the Romans. That the idea that we're going to fight, pierce the wall, pierce the
All
mountain.
that's right. I mean, all that's right. And are we going to train people to be willing to take those kinds of risks? I don't know. No one's training them that way. Avi Weiss is wonderful, but he's not training rabbis to take those kinds of risks. He's just not doing that. That's a personality. That's the kind of thing where you have to look for people who are willing to take these risks. These people who are dealing with their gay, these Rosh Yeshiva are dealing with their gay sons. I mean, they didn't choose that. That's just what happened to them. They talk about, you should listen to these podcasts. I mean, it's unbelievable. They talk about the pain that went into it, but now they're embracing it. And the question is, how do you embrace it? And his son actually is a chazan in Orthodox shuls. Now you don't know that. They don't announce here's the chazan who's gay. Obviously they don't announce it that way, right? But I mean, these are hard things. I mean, I don't know, there are different people. For a while there was a big crisis in the Orthodox community. That there were people who went to prison. Right? There were people who went to prison. That was a thing, in the beginning where no one ever went to prison. There were Orthodox Jews who went to prison. How did they deal with Orthodox Jews who went to prison? What did they do when they got out of prison? They give them aliyahs, were they accepted back in the community? Now that we laugh about that today because now they're a minyanim in Otisville. So what's the big deal if they go to prison? I mean, it's sad that we laugh about it, but we laugh about it. Remember those days when they had these people who went to the beginning in the 70s when they went to prison, and what were we supposed to do with someone who went to prison? But somehow we know how to deal with those people, and you know what? We're better for it. We're better for being willing to embrace people who make mistakes and who serve because they make mistakes and therefore they come back. We're better for that. We'll be better for all these, for all these podcasts and publicizing that.
And for rabbis like you, I find all of it boils down. I like to find the origin of the divergence, and I have a question that basically defines that. And I find it's the difference between evolution and adaptation. Is Judaism evolving, like from slavery to freedom, from polygamy to monogamy, from sacrifice to prayer? Or is it merely adapting, making halacha adapt to microwaves and electricity and cars? Is there room for an evolving role where Judaism is basically changing? This is a forbidden word, where we didn't just stop having slavery or stop having polygamy because life moved on. That was God's purpose. Remember this from this play, this is best of all possible worlds. God is not making mistakes. If this is how it happened, it was meant to happen. So I like to look at this as accepting the world as the world of God, not as an accident because God planned one way and it went another way. So if you accept evolution in Judaism, then it's not a mistake or an accident. Then you move on with these ideas because we were meant to move on. If you don't, then you say we have to just accommodate them as a marginal issue.
Good. I mean, that's a good question. The answer is that we evolve, but we evolve through adaptation. We don't change. Meaning, if you want to look at the role of women now versus the role of women 75 years ago, of course we've evolved. But we didn't evolve because there was one, you see, the conservative movement evolved. Because the conservative movement said that we're going to give women ordination. And the conservative movement said that we're going to have women rabbis. And the conservative movement said we'll have gay rabbis. So the conservative movement evolved. They had a decision. The conservative movement said you can drive to shul on Shabbos. They evolved. Orthodoxy doesn't evolve like that. Orthodoxy evolves through adaptation, right? Women started learning, and they had Beis Yaakov, and then Beis Yaakov became this, and Gemara became halacha, and all of a sudden they became poskot, and all of a sudden you have a new world, and that's the evolution. But it's through adaptation. You see, you can't. The minute you say that Orthodoxy needs to evolve, then they'll pull back. It means Orthodoxy is not evolving about the gays, but this Rosh Yeshiva who talked about his gay son, so that he says you have to adapt. You have to do something. Now, all of a sudden, 50 years from now, long after our time, right? 50 years from now, they're gonna turn around and say, oh my God, the Orthodoxy knows how to deal with gays. Now, I don't know how Orthodoxy is gonna deal with gays. The Pasuk in Chumash, I don't know how Orthodoxy is gonna deal with gays. But I can tell you that over the next 50 years, they're gonna figure out how to deal with gays because there are gonna be so many Orthodox gays, they're gonna deal with them. The same way that, that they're gonna learn how to deal with conversion, they're gonna figure out that, if a person wants to marry someone within the Orthodox community, but is not willing to quite be as frum as they think that you should be, that they're going to be willing to take those people as Jews. You know why they're going to learn to do that? Because they're going to learn that the alternative to that is much worse for Orthodoxy.
I think you're an optimist because I see a total different line. I see a line saying, whenever I introduce this to any group of people talking about it, you know what they say? Look what happened to them. They dropped off the face of the earth. They're not Jews anymore. We are the only Jews still around. And they actually create the problem where we're going to lose them. Because
so I don't think that's true. That's what one of the Rosh Yeshiva's wives once said to me when she got angry at me. She said, what do you teach a Maharat for? She says, your women 20 years from now aren't going to be Orthodox.
And their children.
I want to say, that's dumb.
Yeah.
That's dumb. You can say what I'm doing is wrong. You can say that I'm doing is not Orthodox. But I want to tell you something. The 20 years from now, those women are going to be Orthodox. And their daughter's going to be Orthodox. And their granddaughters are going to be Orthodox.
Prophecy is being...
And they're going to be Orthodox. You're not going to like them 20 years from now the same way you don't like them now. But don't tell me they're not going to be Orthodox. That's a boring argument. That's the argument they made in the 50s and the 60s. That they're going to become conservative. Right? Everybody's going to become conservative. You can't do this because they're going to become conservative. You can't have this because they're going to become conservative. You can't have women doing this because they become conservative. Nobody wants to be conservative. No Orthodox person wants to be conservative. They want to be Orthodox. You want to tell me they'll daven darkly? No, I'm a daven in KRA, or they won't daven to be Amish people. They're Orthodox. Orthodox people want to be Orthodox. Now, they may not be religious. It's possible that our children won't be religious because they won't like religion. But they're not. But the non-religious are non-religious kids. You see, that's an interesting thing also about our non-religious kids are Orthodox. Our non-religious kids are not becoming Reform. Our non-religious kids are not going to Reform temple on Yom Kippur. Like, they're coming with us on Yom Kippur.
There's a great line that says the only shul
I won't go to
doesn't go to is an Orthodox
right,
shul.
It's so silly. They're Orthodox. Now, they're not practicing Orthodox. They're secular Orthodox. But no one wants to be conservative. They kind of missed the memo that told them that that's not true.
It's interesting. Somebody, Daniel Gordis, once spoke in one of the shuls here, BC, before COVID, and he had a very interesting scope on poetry in the last 100 years. And he started from Bialik when he was in yeshiva, Ela Tzipor, going through Bialik's change, Chernichovsky, all through the secular, the ultra anti-religious poets. And what is the topic they all write about? Judaism. They are so anti-Jewish in an Orthodox way. They are more Orthodox in their... That's beautiful. I think that having multiple voices and diversity is what is interesting. Rabbi, there are doubts about the origins of the Torah. With all its tainted anti-Semitic flavored documentary hypotheses had lots of fans these days. As an historian, you must have a better understanding. If the Torah is not divine, what are we honoring? I guess it's between divinity and tradition. I mean, are we just Jews of chicken soup, or are we Jews of Torah's Matan Sinai?
No, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, we can believe the Torah is divine, but academic scholarship raises some interesting questions, and you have to answer those questions within an acceptance of the Torah being divine. I think this has been addressed by a lot of different people. That we can see different things about the academic approach, and we can still believe the Torah is divine.
Rabbi, there's a lot of talk always about Mashiach, Olam Haba, Kabbalah. You said that you're a Litvak, but still, tell us.
I don't know anything about those topics.
Okay. And your view of Tikkun Olam is just living a good life?
I mean, Tikkun Olam. I mean, that's what they joke is. How do you say Tikkun Olam in Hebrew? Right? I mean, that's defined American Judaism. That's okay. I mean, but that's not what I'm interested in. I mean, it's a good thing that we're involved in Tikkun Olam. It's a good thing that we're involved in organizations and UJA and helping people. I mean, that's critical for us. But but that's not enough.
Rabbi, how do you raise your children differently, or how did you raise your children differently than the way you were raised vis-a-vis Judaism?
That's a good question. It's a difference between New York and out of town. We were more exposed to different flavors of Judaism, not only Orthodoxy, of non-Orthodoxy too. We were just exposed to my kids were exposed to different flavors of Judaism.
I find it interesting and kind of sad. A lot of Balei Tshuva who are PhDs and scientists and doctors or whatever, they become Haredi, some of them, and their children barely can read English because it's only Yiddish.
That's a reaction. First of all, the Baal Tshuva movement is nowhere near what the Baal Tshuva movement. There was a moment where there was a Baal Tshuva movement. It was in the 70s, 80s. You have to ask my book wall. The 70s, 80s. There's no Baal Tshuva movement anymore. You don't have that. But that's a reaction when people become frum, so they become very frum. And it's on the West Side also, right? They don't think it's Manhattan School. They think it's Beis Yaakov. Why they think it's Beis Yaakov? Because that's what you're supposed to do. They need to somehow make up for the fact that they didn't grow up Orthodox.
I have a funny way of looking at how rabbis expect us to follow Judaism. And I look at it this way. If you go to a gym and you speak to a trainer, they tell you what to do. You come back, they ask you, how did you do? He says, I did about 20%. Well done. You go to a nutritionist, they tell you what to do, you do quarter of it, well done. The rabbi tells you what to do, you said you did half of it, so why couldn't you do the whole thing? It's an approach to,
it just depends,
to
Rabbi.
Judaism. In a way, I find like chinuch, it's all about validating, about candies and making people feel good so they'll continue. If you tell a kid, where's your kippah, where's your tzitzis, and you give him a hard time on that, do you think he's going to be frum?
So that's an approach, that's important. I mean, Rabbi Joseph H. Lookstein used to say that it's not fair. He says in baseball, if you get one hit out of three, you win the batting championship. And a rabbi, if he gives only 1 out of 3 good sermons, so he's fired. That's the world. I know, it's hard to know. So he said that 75 years ago.
Tell us about your Eshet Chayil, your Rebbitzin, your wife's contribution to or influence or partaking.
She's her own professional. She's very much active in the community, and and we have big Shabbos meals, and people have come over for 35 years. But she's very much a professional. She's a curator at the library, the Jewish Theological Seminary. She's the consultant for Judaica at Sotheby's. She runs the Judaica department for books and manuscripts in Sotheby's. She's the world's greatest expert on Jewish books and manuscripts. So she has a very much of a full-time job herself. I mean, we're moving more into that realm, where the rabbi is married to someone who herself is a professional. And I think the shuls are more or less getting used to that. I think, some shuls are hiring women separately of the rebbitzin. There's an idea that you can't get 2 for 1 anymore, right? That you can't get 2 people for 1 salary. So, that's changing over time. It hasn't changed completely, but I think over time that'll change.
People told me actually they got 2 for 1 with you.
Yes, a 2 for 1. That's the question, the 2 for 1.
A long shot. Rabbi, did you write about Rabbi Teitelbaum?
By Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rav? No.
No, you spoke about it because
I just read an amazing book by David Myers about Kiryas Yoel. If you're interested in that.
It's not only anymore Kiryas Yoel. It's now Kiryas. What did they translated the name Yoel to Tamarim?
Tamar, right. Yeah.
Rabbi, about this Haredim anti-Israel, insisting that if God wanted to redeem us, he would do it himself. We don't have to do it ourselves. And this irony that secular Zionists actually created the state of Israel. It sounds like a very difficult argument to hold, especially for after 100 years of this movement. It reminds me of the guy who was drowning, and they send him a boat, and he said, God will save me. And then they send him a helicopter, say, God will save me. Then he drowns, he comes up, he says, why didn't you save me? He said, sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter. What is the Satmar's view that Israel or Zion, return to Zion, is going to be different.
The Haredim are Zionists. They just don't talk as Zionists. They live in Israel. They take money from the state. I mean, the Satmar Rav was against taking money from the state. But the truth of the matter is the Hasidim take money from the state also now. You know, it means their approach. That's what I told you about Chumrah. You know, it's Chumrah. As long as it's convenient, right? So you what do you pay for my schools? Why say no? I'm not gonna pay. I won't take money for the schools. So the Satmar Rav thought you shouldn't take money for the schools, but it wasn't convenient, so nobody follows that.
Okay.
You know, that's what I'm saying. Some of those people from Eastern Europe, the Satmar Rav, Rav Aaron Cutler, they were fire. They literally were fire coming out of Europe. You know, they believed that the only way to save Judaism, they saw Judaism destroyed. They thought the only way to save Judaism was fire, was to reject everything. We study that just kind of, you know, I'm sorry I never saw Rav Aaron Cutler because I never saw that fire. I'd be interested. It doesn't exist anymore.
Well, there are some people in the renewal and in the other side, on the left, that have some fire, like we talked about Rabbi David Ingber, or some other
fire, which is rejection, not fire that's charisma. Fire that's rejection. Fire that says my way is the only way, and to do anything else, you can't compromise at all.
But what about charisma? Is that not?
No, charisma is great. I mean, but I'm saying charisma is risky now because people with charisma get in trouble. So that's risky.
Rabbi, the last thing I ask is for people to sing some zmiras from your parents, grandparents' stage, or something that's significant and meaningful.
So we sing, on Friday night, we sing Kol Mekadesh. Kol Mekadesh Vi Kara Oila Kol Shomer Shabbos Kadas Mechalelo, Kadas Mechalelo. So that's what we sing every Friday night. That's what my kids sing now at their table. So Kol Makadesh. It's a long zemer, but we sing Kol Makadesh.
We survived it.
Very nice. Very good. Thanks a lot.